My name is Christopher Blake, and I'm a cultural historian specializing in European medieval and Renaissance studies. I've spent the last 12 years working as a research consultant for museums and private collectors, mainly focusing on authenticating historical documents and artifacts. I live a pretty normal life in Boston, spend my weekends hiking, and honestly thought I'd seen everything there was to see in my field. But 4 months ago, something happened during a routine authentication job that made me question everything I believed about how power really works in our world. It started when I received a call from Elena Marchetti, a private collector in Venice who'd inherited her grandmother's estate. She needed someone to authenticate a collection of documents dating back to the 15th century. And my reputation for working with Italian Renaissance materials made me the obvious choice. The pay was excellent, the location was Venice in spring, and I figured it would be a straightforward 2-week job authenticating some old merchant records or family correspondence. I arrived in Venice on a Tuesday morning in March. Elena met me at her palazzo near the Rialto Bridge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an air of old European elegance. The building itself was stunning, one of those classic Venetian palazzos with the ornate facade facing the Grand Canal. But what struck me immediately was how nervous she seemed. Not the usual nervousness of someone dealing with potentially valuable historical items, but something deeper, something that felt like fear. She led me to a private study on the 3rd floor where the documents were waiting. At first glance, they looked exactly like what I'd expected. Merchant records, property deeds, family correspondence from the Marchetti family dating back to the 1400s. Standard stuff for a Venetian noble family. But as I began my preliminary examination, I noticed something odd about the paper quality and ink composition that didn't quite match the supposed dates. Have you ever had that moment when your professional instincts tell you something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? That's exactly what I experienced looking at those documents. The Latin was too clean, the spelling too consistent for the supposed time period, and there were subtle anachronisms in the language that suggested these weren't quite what they appeared to be. But here's where things got interesting. Hidden among the obvious forgeries, I found 3 documents that were absolutely authentic. Not just authentic, but extraordinary. They were written in a mixture of Latin and an old Venetian dialect, and they referenced something called the Nobilitas Nigra, the black nobility. These weren't the merchant records I'd been hired to authenticate. These were something else entirely. The first document was dated 1478 and appeared to be minutes from a meeting. It listed attendees with names I recognized from Venetian history, members of the Dandolo, Morosini, and Contarini families, among others. But the content was what made my hands literally tremble as I read it. They weren't just discussing political influence. They were planning assassinations. The document contained detailed plans for the removal of Lorenzo de Medici, with specific methods, timing, and cover stories already prepared. But here's what made my blood run cold. I knew from historical records that Lorenzo had indeed survived an assassination attempt in 1478, exactly as described in contingency plans outlined in this document. They hadn't just been discussing what they called the management of European succession. They had been actively orchestrating murders, coups, and political upheavals across the continent. What do you think about documents like this? Do they sound like the paranoid fantasies of conspiracy theorists? Or could there be something more to them? I spent the next 3 days carefully photographing and translating these documents, working late into the night in that palazzo study. Elena would bring me coffee and pastries, but I noticed she never asked about my progress. Most clients are eager to know what their artifacts might be worth, but she seemed almost reluctant to hear what I might discover. The second document was the one that really opened my eyes to the scope of what I was looking at. Dated 1491, it contained detailed financial records showing massive loans made to various European royal houses. But these weren't typical banking records. The terms were bizarre. Instead of interest, the borrowers agreed to what the document called consultative obligations regarding major policy decisions. The French crown, the Holy Roman Empire, even the English monarchy had apparently entered into these agreements. I'm trained to be skeptical of extraordinary claims, but the paper analysis, ink composition, and historical cross-references all confirmed these documents were genuine. The handwriting matched known samples from the scribes of these families, and the watermarks were consistent with 15th century Venetian paper mills that had been documented by other historians. But the third document was what made me realize I'd stumbled onto something that extended far beyond historical curiosity. It was dated 1503 and written in what appeared to be a code, but one that used Latin root words in a systematic way. After 2 days of analysis, I managed to decode portions of it. What I found made me physically sick. It was a detailed operational manual for what they called succession engineering, a step-by-step guide for manipulating royal bloodlines through strategic marriages, targeted eliminations, and fabricated inheritance claims. The document included actual genealogical charts showing how they had successfully altered 3 major European royal lines over just 50 years, with specific notes about which heirs had been redirected and which marriages had been facilitated through blackmail or financial pressure. But here's what truly terrified me. The document contained a prophetic section about future applications of proven methods. It described techniques for influencing democratic processes that wouldn't be invented for another 3 centuries. Things like media manipulation, financial market pressure, and what they called systematic narrative coordination. It was as if they had written a blueprint for modern political control 400 years before modern politics even existed. Have you ever noticed how certain historical events seem to happen in ways that benefit specific families or regions, even when logic suggests the outcomes should have been different? After reading these documents, I started seeing European history in a completely different light. I was so absorbed in my work that I almost didn't notice when Elena's behavior changed. On my 5th day in Venice, she started asking specific questions about what I'd found. Not casual questions, but detailed inquiries about which documents I'd examined and whether I'd made copies of anything. When I mentioned the 3 authentic documents, her face went pale. That evening, she asked me to join her for dinner at a small restaurant away from the tourist areas. Over wine and seafood, she told me something that I'm still trying to process. Her grandmother, she said, had been the last keeper of these documents for what she called the families. Elena had inherited not just the papers, but the responsibility that came with them. The black nobility, she explained, isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a tradition that never ended. According to Elena, the families I'd read about in those documents had maintained their network of influence through 5 centuries of European history. They'd adapted to changing times, moving from direct control over monarchies to subtler influence over financial institutions, political parties, and international organizations. The old Venetian merchant families had evolved into modern power brokers, but their methods remained remarkably consistent. She showed me a modern document, a meeting agenda from just 18 months ago. The names were different, but the structure was identical to what I'd seen in the 15th century papers. Current members included individuals whose names I recognized from international banking, European Union leadership, and major multinational corporations. But what made my stomach drop was seeing a specific agenda item dated March 20th, 2023. COVID policy transition strategies and economic restructuring opportunities. I stared at that date because I remembered exactly what had happened in March 2023. That was when multiple European countries simultaneously announced the end of their pandemic emergency measures, despite different infection rates and economic conditions. At the time, journalists had noted how surprisingly coordinated these announcements were, but no one could explain why governments with different political parties and different national interests would make identical policy shifts within the same week. According to the document Elena showed me, this coordination hadn't been coincidental. The meeting minutes outlined how family-controlled financial institutions had applied strategic pressure through bond markets and currency exchanges to ensure unified policy changes. They had engineered the timing to maximize what they called economic rebalancing opportunities, essentially profiting from the market volatility they had created through coordinated government announcements. What struck me most was how reasonable Elena made it all sound. These weren't cartoon villains plotting world domination. They were highly educated, culturally sophisticated individuals who genuinely believed they were providing stability and guidance to complex systems that might otherwise collapse into chaos. From their perspective, they weren't manipulating democracy. They were preserving it by ensuring that critical decisions were made by people with the historical perspective and resources to understand long-term consequences. But here's what disturbed me most: the effectiveness of their approach. When Elena showed me financial reports documenting the outcomes of decisions that had been discussed in their meetings, the numbers were staggering. The coordinated COVID policy changes alone had generated over 4 billion euros in profits for companies connected to Black nobility families, while simultaneously destabilizing smaller competitors who hadn't been prepared for the sudden policy shifts. It wasn't just influence, it was systematic wealth transfer on a scale that affected entire national economies. Do you think there's a meaningful difference between coordination and conspiracy? Between influence and control? Because after seeing these documents, I'm honestly not sure where to draw those lines. I finished my authentication work and returned to Boston, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I discovered. I started researching the historical members of the Black nobility, tracing their family trees and business connections through to the present day. What I found was a web of relationships that extends through virtually every major institution in European finance, politics, and culture. The Dandolo family, for example, has descendants who hold senior positions in 3 major international banks. The Morosini lineage connects to board members of several Fortune 500 companies and 2 prominent think tanks that advise European government policy. These aren't random coincidences. They're the result of 5 centuries of strategic relationship building and institutional placement. But the most unsettling discovery came when I started looking at patterns in recent European political decisions. Trade policies that seemed economically irrational suddenly made sense when viewed through the lens of benefiting specific family business interests. Cultural preservation initiatives that received mysterious funding could be traced back to foundations controlled by Black nobility descendants. 3 weeks after returning from Venice, I received a phone call that changed everything. The caller identified himself as a representative of a European historical research foundation that I'd never heard of. He offered me a substantial consulting contract to work on what he described as sensitive historical documentation projects, with full academic freedom and excellent compensation. The offer was tempting, almost suspiciously so. But when I asked for more details about the specific projects and the foundation's funding sources, the responses were vague in ways that made my professional instincts scream warnings. After declining the offer, I started noticing other changes. Academic conferences I'd regularly attended stopped sending me invitations. A book contract I'd been negotiating with a university press was suddenly canceled due to budget constraints. Colleagues who had collaborated with me for years became mysteriously unavailable for new projects. Have you ever experienced the feeling that invisible forces are subtly reshaping your professional life? It's not dramatic enough to call harassment, but it's consistent enough that you know it's not coincidental. I realized that my discovery in Venice had consequences I hadn't anticipated. The modern descendants of the Black nobility weren't just maintaining their historical influence, they were actively protecting it. And my research had apparently crossed a line from academic curiosity into unwelcome scrutiny. But here's what's really fascinating. They're not trying to silence me completely. Instead, they're redirecting my career in ways that move me away from areas where I might stumble across similar discoveries. I've received multiple offers to work on projects involving American colonial history or Asian cultural artifacts, areas completely unrelated to European medieval and Renaissance studies. It's almost elegant, really. Rather than creating a scandal by overtly suppressing my research, they're simply making it more attractive for me to focus my expertise elsewhere. From their perspective, it's probably a win-win solution. I get to continue my career, and they get to maintain their privacy. The question that keeps me awake at night is this: if a network of influence that's sophisticated and that persistent has been operating for 500 years, what other institutions and decisions are being guided by similar groups? The Black nobility of Venice might just be one example of a much larger pattern of coordinated influence that most of us never suspect exists. I've started paying attention to seemingly unrelated events in ways I never did before. When major economic policies are announced simultaneously across multiple European countries, when cultural funding appears for projects that serve specific political narratives, When academic research in certain areas receives generous support while other areas face budget cuts, I find myself wondering who might be coordinating these patterns. What do you think? Have you noticed unexplained consistencies in how certain types of decisions get made, especially at the international level? Do you think coordination between powerful families and institutions is necessarily a bad thing? Or could it sometimes serve legitimate purposes? The documents I discovered in Venice are real. The family connections I traced are verifiable through public records. The patterns of influence I identified can be confirmed by anyone willing to spend time researching corporate boards, foundation funding sources, and political advisory relationships. But what I can't prove is intent. I can't demonstrate that these connections are being used deliberately to manipulate outcomes, rather than simply representing the natural result of wealthy, educated families maintaining relationships across generations. The line between influence and control, between coordination and conspiracy, remains frustratingly unclear. What I do know is that Elena Marchetti was right about one thing. The black nobility didn't disappear into history. It evolved, adapted, and continued operating in ways that are probably more sophisticated now than they were 5 centuries ago. Whether you consider that frightening or reassuring probably depends on how much you trust powerful people to act in ways that benefit society rather than just themselves. I'm still working as a cultural historian, though my focus has indeed shifted toward American colonial documents. The work is interesting, the pay is good, and nobody seems concerned about what I might discover in 18th century Pennsylvania trade records. But sometimes, when I'm walking through Boston's financial district or reading about European Union policy decisions, I remember those documents in that Venetian palazzo. I remember Elena's nervous expressions and those phone calls redirecting my career. And I wonder, how many other researchers have stumbled across similar discoveries? How many other Elena Marchettis are out there, keeping family secrets that connect to networks of influence most of us never suspect exist? If you've ever encountered unexplained patterns in how major decisions get made, or if you've noticed that certain families seem to maintain influence across multiple generations and industries, I'd be genuinely interested to hear about it in the comments. Because after what I discovered in Venice, I'm convinced that the history we read in textbooks represents only a fraction of how power actually operates in our world. The black nobility might be just one example of something much larger and much more pervasive than any of us realize. And honestly, I'm not sure whether that should terrify us or reassure us. Maybe both.